Good afternoon. I'm Kes Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre. We exist to make the positive case for politics and public service, and we seek to do that in three key ways. We do research. We study the relationship between the public and their politicians, and we seek to amplify the research of other people doing similar work. And you can find more evidence of that in our research hub on our website, johnsmithcentre.com. We also run a variety of different internship and development programmes designed to break down the barriers that people face accessing public life, and we'll talk about some of that today. Finally, though, we seek to do some advocacy work. We seek to make the positive case for politics with events like today's, discussing the role of the House of Commons, the problems that it's faced recently, and what we can do to rebuild trust and faith in politics and political institutions that govern our lives. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Hannah Wright. Hannah is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Government and a regular commentator on Westminster and Whitehall across radio and television. She was awarded an OBE in 2020 for her services to the Constitution, no less. Her book, Held in Contempt, What's Wrong with the House of Commons, was published in paperback form last week, so it's literally hot off the press and it couldn't be more timely. This event is recorded so that we can make it available for people to watch in their own time and to share it through our networks here at the University of Glasgow and further afield. Hannah, welcome to the Centre.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're thrilled to have you here. Now, you describe yourself as a profound supporter of representative democracy. Just how much trouble is it in?
Well, I think, that's a really important question for us to be thinking about. I think it's really easy for there to be just a sort of underlying sense that democracy's in trouble. But what I try to do in the book is really sort of interrogate to what extent and why, and what are the things that could be done about it. As you say, it's very much focused on Westminster and in particular on the House of Commons. And that's partly because I used to work in the House of Commons as a clerk, as part of the administration there. And since I moved to the Institute for Government, I've been very focused on sort of studying the House of Commons, studying Westminster. So some of the things that I'll say, I think today are probably sort of very much driven by my experience in Westminster, but it'd be really interesting to talk to you, Kezia, about the parallels with Scotland and indeed more broadly. So how much trouble are we in? Well, I think, there is quite a lot of sort of international literature looking at trends in sort of people's attitudes to democracy. Obviously, we've all had the sort of shock of the war in Ukraine, which has made a lot of us reflect on the value of our democracy and how important it is to us and how actually we do need to value it. But I think there's quite a lot of evidence that in general, attitudes to institutions have been changing over recent decades, and the trust in institutions, and in particular in Parliament, has dropped. And the figures really, which I look at in the book in relation to the Parliament in Westminster, are really stark. I mean, between 1981 and 2010, trust in Parliament in Westminster dropped from 41% to 24%. And then that was the point at which we then had the MP's expenses scandal, and then trust dropped even further to 19%. So only like less than 1 in 5 people said they tended to trust Parliament as an institution. And I think that is a massive problem. And there can be a tendency on the part of politicians to just say, oh, 'twas ever thus, nobody ever trusts politicians, isn't it sad? But it's not true. When you look at the comparative data, and you compare trust in Parliament across the EU, for example, across Europe, lots of other countries, people have higher levels of trust. And in that same 30-year period that I first talked about from the 1980s to the 2010s, other countries increased, the levels of trust in parliaments increased. In Denmark, it's up around 60%. So 19% is really bad. And it's also bad in relation to, if you compare it to other institutions in the UK. Obviously, I guess, people would expect, that people have higher trust in judges and so on, but Parliament is one of the lowest in terms of being an institution. So why is that? And as I've said, there've been a number of scandals, but I think we've also had recently a sort of confluence of different events which have really served further to undermine public trust in Parliament. And I think one is has been Brexit. So, firstly, when the UK government under Theresa May started to set about trying to sort of give effect to the outcome of the referendum, she did so in a way that really excluded Parliament. So she set up a whole load of red lines about what she was going to negotiate for without there ever being a debate in Parliament about those. Then she sort of said, well, I can't give a running commentary, and she tried to sort of push away attempts from Parliament to get involved and to scrutinise the negotiation process. I think that was really damaging. And then then as the process went on and Parliament didn't like what she was doing and so on, there started to be this narrative that she set up, which was that there was an opposition between representative democracy in the Parliament as representative democracy and the referendum as direct democracy, and that those were set up in sort of opposition to each other, which I don't think, we might come on to talk about this, I don't think they need to be. And that sort of Parliament was trying to undermine the outcome of the referendum. That, I think, was bad for Parliament's reputation. Then Boris Johnson came in and he doubled down on that narrative, because Parliament wouldn't either allow him to sort of use a no-deal exit as a negotiating tactic, or give him a general election, which is what he really wanted. So he was stuck. We had the whole prorogation of Parliament episode, which was really bad. I think it signalled for government to give that actually we're about to leave the EU. It's one of the most significant constitutional changes we're going to have in our country, and it doesn't matter if Parliament's not around to talk about it. So I think that was really bad. Then, of course, we've had coronavirus since then. Again, I feel, and I talk about this in the book, that the role of Parliament has been very much sidelined during coronavirus, in part because it's had to be, because governments had to work quickly in some ways. But again, ministers have got used to sort of setting Parliament aside, and I think that's a problem. And then, of course, we come to the last couple of years and a series of ethical scandals, arguably starting with the Owen Paterson scandal about paid advocacy in the House of Commons. We've had Partygate, which has reinforced, I think, the public sense that some politicians feel there's one set of rules for them and another for the public, which creates a distance between politicians and the people they represent. And that's sort of very much carrying on to today. And then we've just most recently, in the last couple of weeks, had these series of scandals in Westminster about sexism and misogyny. So all in all, not a great situation to be in. It would be the quick answer.
I think that's a really helpful summary, though, of the journey that we've taken to get to the point that we're at, and we'll explore what that might mean for public policy and a bit further along. So here is the book itself. Just got to flash it to prove that we've got a copy here at the John Smith Centre, and we've been scouring through it very, very carefully. I do want to get into some of the detail of it with you, but I'm first of all really intrigued by the structure or the process that you went through in order to write the book, because it's clearly informed by your own knowledge and experience, but there's a lot more input to it from other sources too. And together it presents a diagnosis of the problem around 5 really key themes about the extent to the threat that the House of Commons faces. And you describe those as the House of Commons being sidelined, and you've referenced that already in the context of Brexit, about it being unrepresentative, about it being arcane as an institution, exceptionalist and decaying. So how did you get to that sort of diagnosis of those 5 key problems? What was the work or the research element behind the book?
So I think it really came from just 20 years of working in and around Westminster, and a series of sort of frustrations, I guess, that I had. And trying to then, really at the start of lockdown in 2020, sit down and think through what the actual mechanisms were, I guess, whereby you could link this sense that there is a low level of public trust, and what there is that the House of Commons could actually do about it. Because, it's actually, in many ways, it's quite a short book, it's quick and absorbing read, but, it's quite short. There's only so much I could cover. And, if you were going to do a whole enormous research piece on everything that drives public trust, you'd have to look at lots of other things. You'd have to look at the role of political parties, You'd have to look at much longer term sort of secular trends and trust and so on. But what I really wanted to focus on, and I guess this is driven by my experience of working with MPs and working really quite closely with the political process in Westminster, was when the thing that really struck me was that when MPs, when something goes wrong in the House of Commons, as it has a lot in recent weeks, there's often a tendency of MPs to sort of just say, oh, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. It's just a bad apple is one of the things, you know, it's nothing to do with the culture or the institution. So that person needs to just not do that thing that they've done wrong, or to say there's nothing we can do about this. And I strongly feel that actually there are things that MPs themselves can do to change the levels of public trust in the House of Commons. And I wanted to focus in on those. So the way I went about it was talking to lots of MPs, which happily I have the opportunity to do through my job anyway. Really picking up on some of those, you know, sort of individuals from all parties in Westminster who I thought I'd come across that were a bit more thoughtful about some of these topics, because, you know, it's not something that all MPs find the time, you know, for really understandable reasons to reflect on, you know, the strength of Parliament as an institution itself. So I talked to lots of people. I talked to my former sort of colleagues who work in the House of Commons, and I started to explore, you know, I was aware of some of the literature, but I started to explore some of the literature. I should say it's in any way an academic book. You know, it refers, where I'm aware of the literature, it refers to it, but it's, you know, if it would be a whole different thing if it was a sort of detailed academic exploration. It refers to bits and pieces of relevant academic work in quite a light touch way. And then when I'd written the chapters, and I think it's probably fair to admit that because it was written over lockdown and very much in around my day job and my three kids, I wrote it as, it's almost like a series of 5 essays with an introduction and a conclusion. So there's 5 themes that you picked up on, Kezia. And so each time I finished a chapter, I sent it off to a bunch of people who I thought would have views and got their feedback on how, whether I'd picked up the right issues and some challenge, and that was a really useful process.
I think for the purposes of today, we would really like to talk to you about the theme around how representative the House of Commons is, and we'll come to that in a second. But I just wanted to say to everybody in the audience that they too can be a part of this conversation, and to do so, all they need to do is to type their questions into the Q&A box at the foot of their screens, and that will come through to our moderation team here at the John Smith Centre, and I'll be able to put those to Hannah over the course of the next 45 minutes that we've got left together. So on the theme of representation, there's lots of detail here that we can get into. I wonder if you could start by just giving us an overview of how representative the House of Commons actually is. How much does it look like us?
Not enough is the short answer. And, you know, I haven't got all the detailed statistics, they're all in the book. But I mean, to take, you know, the aspect of representation, which is often focused on, and it's by no means the only one that we need to focus on, in terms of gender, women have been able to be elected to the House of Commons for 100 years. And yet we still only have 1/3 of MPs being female, and there were 650 MPs in the House of Commons. We still haven't had 650 female MPs elected ever, you know, in that over that entire 100-year period, which I think is pathetic. You know, we've had 100 years to get there, and you know, and it's also dispiriting because we know what works in terms of some of this stuff. You know, we can come on to that. So yeah, in terms of gender, about 1/3 female, not at all equally distributed between parties. Then we, in terms of ethnicity, the House of Commons is underrepresents minority ethnic communities, particularly actually MPs who come to Westminster from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are particularly minority ethnic groups are particularly underrepresented from those parts of the UK. it's hard to know exactly in terms of sexuality and gender identity, because people don't always disclose these things, obviously. And so we don't know, or we will know from the census to an extent now, about representation in the country as a whole. But so there's been some estimates done of representation of sexuality within the House of Commons, and that appears to be underrepresented. Then in terms of age, on average, MPs are older than the general population. You might think that's not a problem. In some ways, you want people who've got a bit more experience and of life before they go into politics. On the other hand, I think it's really important for a whole range of different people with different life experience and at different points in their life to be represented, and people in the youngest and the oldest age groups are underrepresented in comparison to the population. And then if you try to look at the sort of socioeconomic sort of background of MPs, the proxy, the way to do that is by education, and it's not perfect, but that is one way to do it. And privately educated people are overrepresented, and people who've been to university are overrepresented in the House of Commons.
So I think it's very easy for people like us who work in and around politics and have done for a long time to just present as fact that representation and how diverse that representation is matters. But it does need a bit of explaining, and there's a very solid evidence base behind it, which you articulate really well in the book. I think you've got a 3-part argument as to why who the MPs are really does matter. Can you talk us through that? And then we'll get into the detail of women in particular, I think.
Yeah, sure. So, and when I started to look into it, I think I was in exactly the sort of the position that you say, Kezia. I was kind of like, I sort of have a sense that this is important, but actually looking into why it's important was an interesting process for me. And I think there are actually 4 things you can look at. So the first is a pure, straight up justice argument. So that it ought to be that anyone who is eligible to become a member of Parliament is able to become a member of Parliament, and it should not be the case that any aspect of their any characteristic that they have, whether it's their gender, their age, anything like that, should be a barrier to them becoming a member of Parliament, because anyone who is over 18 and not bankrupt, and there are various things, but basically anyone should be able to do it, and that's just a matter of basic justice. It shouldn't be that some groups of society find it easier than others. But there's also, I think, an important argument around symbolism. So our Parliament is the body within the country which creates the laws that everybody has to follow. And if those laws are created by someone by a set of people who are not, and those laws include, inclusion laws, regulations and so on, things around equality, things around diversity, which are all required of other workplaces. And I think if Parliament doesn't look representative itself, then symbolically it's kind of, it feels wrong that should be the body which is determining those, setting those sorts of requirements for everyone else. Then, and I think there's a sort of flowing from that, there's a sort of legitimacy argument. And I think this is really important. We've seen it in the context of the pandemic. If people look at a Parliament and don't see people who look like them, or, obviously it's not just about visible characteristics, but if they don't feel that the people who are there making decisions on their behalf understand their life experience and understand where they're coming from, they are less likely to want to see as legitimate the decisions that flow from that institution. So, and we definitely saw this. If you compare between different countries, the extent to which people were prepared to, when the government said, follow these rules about lockdown, or, get yourself vaccinated, different countries have different levels of trust in their government and the rules that the government was putting out. And that really had a dramatic effect on those things like vaccine hesitancy and so on. And so I think that in terms of the legitimacy of the sort of the government that flows from Parliament, it's really important for people to see that Parliament includes people like them. And then finally, and this is, I think, one of the really interesting ones, is around effectiveness. In order to be an effective institution, there need to be people with a sort of representative range of life experience within the institution. And so what I mean by that is there is really good evidence that, obviously, an MP can go into Parliament and represent their constituent, even if they have no shared life experience. Their constituent has said to them, this has been my experience, and that MP can go in and talk about it and raise their case and discuss it. That can happen, but there is good evidence that that people are more likely to and more effective at raising issues which relate to their own experience. So, and Harriet Harman, who's a long-standing Labour MP, has talked about this in the context of, came in. She was one of the first sort of, not one of the first women, but one of the women who came in at a point when there just started to be a few more women in the House of Commons. And she said it was really noticeable that issues like childcare and issues like sort of, I think sort of flexible working and things like that started to get on the agenda because women were putting them on the agenda, and men might have been aware of them, but they just didn't necessarily bring them up and want to talk about them. So if you have more people with more different life experience, they are more likely to raise a wider range of issues which are relevant to those people in society who have those different experiences. And we've seen it, in recent years. We've had really good debates in the House of Commons about things like childhood bereavement and mental health, and MPs who've come in who've had those experience. And sometimes those can be quite stigmatized topics or just under-discussed topics, but MPs with that experience come in and want to talk about it. And when they do it, it has a really important, I think, sort of powerful effect for the country, because then it gets reported and people see that this is something that gets discussed publicly and so on. So there's just a couple of examples of ways in which actually, if you have a more representative House, it also becomes a more effective House for the people it is supposed to be representing.
And I think it's hugely helpful to have that all articulated in your book, just as a reference point for people who've long believed this, but have almost forgotten the rationale for why. And that latter argument that you make, I think, comes from a lot of the research work that Professor Sarah Childs has done around the degree to which representation makes for better public policy making. And we're Sarah is a friend of the John Smith Centre, and we're delighted that she's now up in Scotland and working very closely with the Scottish Parliament on its A Parliament for All project, which is looking at the Scottish Parliament and the degree to which it can equip itself to be fit for the future and to maintain its image, which doesn't always live up in practice to this idea of being a family-friendly Parliament. And just reflecting on your comments there about childcare, acutely aware that the nature of how childcare was discussed and debated and legislated for in the Scottish Parliament changed when party leaders were female, and suddenly it became a very prominent economic argument about women's participation in the labour market, rather than it being some sort of secondary aspect of the education system.
Sort of special interest for women.
Absolutely, and that for me has always been a really strong case in point in why it matters in the context of public policy making. Just a reminder to folk, if they want to add their own questions, that they can do so through the Q&A function, but I have a long list, so we will not struggle here. Hannah, can I take you back to the issue of women's representation, which you've articulated so well? That stark figure about, there being 550 female MPs ever, in contrast to the total number of MPs in any one session. I was really struck, just doing a little bit of snap analysis after the last general election in 2019, that what we were also seeing, though, was women who'd had careers in Parliament stepping away at an earlier age than their male counterparts with fewer years served. And that was all before the dramas of late around the culture of misogyny and people speaking out about it. Of course, those behaviours were existing beforehand. People just weren't able to talk about them in the way that they might be feeling able to do now. I wonder if you could maybe offer us some of your own reflections on whether women have to behave differently in Parliament in order to survive or to progress or to get work done, and whether that might be changing now, or if there's any hope that it might change now.
I'd really be actually really interested in your thoughts on that case as well. And to go back to just something you just said, Sarah Charles was enormously helpful with the book and with that chapter, and her work is really, really interesting. So I totally endorse what you said about that. Yeah, so I think it is really interesting, and the thing that's really struck me in the last couple of weeks with this sort of misogyny scandal breaking in Westminster is the reluctance of female MPs to be publicly identified as criticising their colleagues, and the sense they have that if they come out and are, publicly accuse someone of doing something, it is they that will suffer the consequences for their career, rather than the person who may have done something, completely unacceptable. And I think that tells you a lot about the nature of the culture and the fact that it is not where we need it to be as yet. So I think it is true that women in politics, like men in politics, and I spoke for the book, I spoke to men who talked to me about the difficulties, particularly of the Brexit period in Westminster, and the sort of venom and the social media attacks and the impact on their mental health of the really, really difficult period that Westminster went through, where I think a lot of the sort of normal sort of social groupings and things within Parliament broke down because people's views on Brexit didn't align with their party views. And so people were trying to, and they didn't necessarily align with their constituencies' views. And so people, where they normally might have had a sense of their sort of role as an MP and how that related to their party and their constituency and their interests and so on, that was all thrown up in the air. And that was tremendously difficult for people. I think it had a big impact on mental health. It had an impact on people's family sort of relationships and so on. And I think that is what led to what you exactly identify about quite a lot of women deciding this just wasn't for them anymore and leaving at a sooner point than you would have expected in terms of their career and leaving the House. And I think that should be really, really troubling for us. Now, obviously, that was a particularly bad period, but the fact is it's not atypical, and you know more about this than me firsthand, but it's not atypical for female MPs to experience a great deal of abuse online with social media. The evidence is that women get more abuse and more sort of personal abuse than men do, and so in order to withstand that, you have to be tough. And you have to be, somebody who's got a thick skin and who's able to push through it. And I think a lot of MPs present a sort of a strong front, but actually it's different. That stuff has to be difficult for anyone. But as I say in the book, I think it's worrying that if we end up in a situation where it's only the people who are really thick-skinned and able to contemplate the idea of putting themselves and their families and their friends through the awfulness of being a public figure and being a member of Parliament, that's selecting a set of people to make all decisions on our behalf who have a certain set of personal characteristics. And yes, it makes them able to function in that system, but I really think we need to take a hard look at that system to say, actually, what we really would like is a more diverse set of, a range of people. And, this speaks to much bigger questions also about social media and anonymity and all these sorts of things, but I think that you have to be really thick-skinned, and that's not an easy thing to ask of people.
I always used to say, for what it was worth, that you needed a skin as thick as a rhino to survive, but it couldn't be so thick as to lose your ability to empathise. And that's actually the danger, I think, is if our MPs have to become so resilient, so tough, that they can no longer relate to the people that they seek to represent on a human level. I think that could take us into an even deeper nadir than we're already in. Just reflecting back on some of the things you said there about women's representation, I long believed throughout my political activism that in order to challenge the culture that we're talking about here, what you needed was critical mass, that it would all just get instantly better once you had more women in Parliament. And I'm feeling quite bleak about that now, because we are at the point where we've had the highest percentage of female MPs in the history of the Commons, albeit it's still not high enough. But for the reasons you've just described about women having to conform and not be the ones to put their head above the parapet and speak out and to challenge systems and behaviour, it's very slow progress. I wonder if you'd agree with me then that the burden needs to stop lying with women and perhaps needs to shift onto the institution itself, and whether you have any prescriptions within your book about what the House of Commons should be doing to make the environment better for women.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do agree with that. And I think that it's about, I mean, there are lots of things in terms of why progress has been so slow, which relate to political parties' choices about, selection, and they relate to the voting system and safe seats, and the fact that, in a safe seat, it's essentially the members of the party in that safe seat who get to select the MP, not the voters in general. So however diverse the set of people they're choosing from, if it's a safe seat, they're just choosing the person who's already been pre-selected for them. And so there are lots of things for political parties. But what I wanted to look at in the book was, how do you make the House of Commons seem an inclusive, attractive environment for people to want to come and work in? And that just sounds like a ridiculous thing to say right now, doesn't it? After the last couple of weeks, which is so depressing. But so there are some things I think about, I talk about in the book. So some of it is about the physical environment. And the Palace of Westminster is a building from a different era, and it's it was designed at the height of empire, in a society which was very hierarchical, where there was a very kind of a sense that MPs were these higher beings, and the public were sort of not necessarily to be welcomed into sort of interact with parliamentarians. We are in a different place now, which is great, and I think that there is much more of a sense in Parliament that it ought to be directly interacting with people, and that the parliamentary building and so on ought to be open to the people. But it is just a barrier. There are bits of Parliament which have been built more recently, Portcullis House, which is sort of more accessible and open. But just going to Parliament can be quite a off-putting experience for people. So I think, what I say in the book is that the fact that the Palace of Westminster needs to be renovated badly, and there's a whole chapter, which, as you say, I called decaying. I debated a long time about what the right word was, but anyway, decaying, it ended up. It's falling down, it needs renovating, but a series of generations of politicians have not grasped that nettle. That's one thing, but actually, when you're renovating it, you also ought to be thinking about how to update it for the 21st century and make it a much more accessible place. But that hasn't really even got onto the agenda, because MPs are so averse to actually what they're going to need to do, which is move out in order to do the work at all. And it's so prohibitively expensive because it's a grade 1 listed building and it's in the centre of London, that the idea that you also might think about how to make the building accessible, and the Scottish Parliament built much more recently has a lot of thinking went into that. Same with the Welsh Parliament, and Westminster is way away from that. So that's one thing. I really bemoan the fact. I can see the reasons why. I bemoan the fact that it's not physically as an environment, it's not accessible. And then there are lots of things around making opportunities for women, but also other minority groups, to get involved in sort of positions of responsibility within the House, in the governance of the House, and because the evidence is that when that happens, different decisions get made, and people can think it's just a kind of a sort of tokenistic thing, or we have to have women on this body or that body. Actually, no, it's not about tokenism. You get a different outcome, and there's loads of literature that shows that.
That's really helpful, and just makes an awful lot of sense in the context of my own experiences and what we've witnessed in Scotland. I want to take a slight handbrake turn and look at some of the big issues that are coming down the track rather than things that we're experiencing just now. And it's come from the audience, but it's really, I think, sparked by your earlier remarks about the pandemic being really indicative of why this really matters, because there are emergencies, there are moments in time where the decisions that governments take materially impact not just how we function in our daily lives, but our actual livelihoods and future health prospects. a question here from the audience. How can representative democracy and parliaments as institutions tackle the existential challenges we face? I'm thinking of the climate and ecological emergencies and technological innovation, both of which are incredibly complicated and will affect every aspect of our lives over the next 20 years.
That's a brilliant question. And actually it's one that I'm thinking, I haven't told my husband this, but I was thinking about when I'm thinking about for my second book. But I think it is a really important question for parliaments and representative democracy to grapple with, because, and this came up in an event I was speaking at yesterday, it's a classic problem of collective action. And we see it writ small in Parliament in terms of how can you get MPs collectively to think about the reputation of the institution? How can you get them to think about a collective problem like the fact that the Palace of Westminster is falling down and to come together to deal with it? And then exactly the same collective action problem applies when you think about something like climate change. So, I mean, there's a whole set of questions, I think, around politics and how politics works. And one of the things we're sort of starting to see emerge in Westminster, which I think is really worrying, is a breakdown of the sort of consensus that there was around net zero as a kind of as a goal. To take climate as, you know, one big example of this. And it's starting to be a bit more of a divisive issue, and there's an emergence of a sort of a group of conservative backbenchers who are questioning the kind of sort of, I think they're playing the concerns around the cost of living crisis, and questioning whether actually net zero is a goal that ought to be pursued. And I think that is, you know, that is quite a worrying thing for those of us who think that the climate emergency is something that everybody ought to be pulling together on. So there's that side of things and how politics plays, but there's also, I think, some sort of more technical things around what parliaments can do. And I think this is part of a bigger question. And I don't know, it might be something that your centre, Kezia, is also thinking about how representative democracy can engage and interlock with participative and deliberative techniques, which are ways to really bring a different sort of evidence into the process and a different sort of understanding about what the public think about these issues and how you can bring the public along. Because I think that you have the traditional approach is to say, well, you know, you elect 650 MPs and they come to Parliament and they represent their constituents and they make the decisions. But actually, I think on something as big and difficult as climate change, where actually what we need is to work out how we're all going to adapt and we're all going to change our behaviours. That can't be something that MPs just kind of form an impression of and go to Westminster and they make the decisions. We sort of have to have a big conversation about it. And I sort of think representative democracy isn't adequate to the task. I think we need to think about how to enhance it. And I don't think it's one or the other again. I think it's what are the techniques? And I mean, there was a big climate assembly commissioned by 6 select committees in Westminster. I know that the Scottish government has done some work with citizens' assemblies and so on as well. And those are sort of starting to be models for ways in which parliaments can possibly think a bit differently about this stuff. And I don't yet feel that they're fully integrated enough. I sort of feel that certainly the Climate Assembly in Westminster was sort of commissioned, did its thing. That's all very interesting. Some select committees might pick up on a few recommendations here or there. I don't feel that it's a fully enough integrated process yet, but I sort of think it's the start of something, and something that's actually going to be really important if representative democracy and parliaments are going to stay relevant and useful to solving these big problems that we face.
So some of the people who were involved in the citizens' assemblies in Scotland in terms of their structure and how they functioned are watching today. So it may be that we get a flurry of questions now that we've started on this topic. The John Smith Centre doesn't have a position on the extent to which deliberative democracy techniques or participative democracy techniques should be used, because our main business is in trying to defend representative democracy. And I toil with the question that you've just posed regularly, Hannah, because sometimes I wonder whether moving these issues to things like citizens' juries almost let representatives off the hook. If we say this is just too difficult for Parliament, we must give it to somebody else. And I also worry about whether citizens' juries are truly representative, or whether they just centralise power in a new form of middle class domination without doing the heavy work that we really need to do to defend Parliament and representative democracy as something as we want for the long term. But just to stick with climate change just for a moment longer, and then I'd really like to get to the issue of trust and one or two more audience questions. It strikes me when we talk about net zero and all the difficult choices that we have to make in order to meet those 2030 targets in Scotland or 2040 across the United Kingdom, the nature of what that public policy looks like in order to make that target is bad news. It's bad news for consumers. It's public policy which is also deeply unequal. It will hurt poorer people to a greater extent, even more so if they live in rural areas. How do those realities and where we stand in terms of trust get along? I mean, it strikes me that the public are going to be incredibly reticent to receive some of the hard news that's coming down the line. What happens if the public just simply refuse to accept this, if they don't trust their leaders? What's next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a thing we all need to grapple with, and I think this is why it's so important for an honest conversation to be had. And I know that's a really easy thing to say, but it's why my heart sinks when governments too often sort of go for a very kind of techno optimist. By 2050, surely we'll just have carbon-free technologies and everything will be fine because we will invent something which is going to solve this problem for us. That's a parody of the argument, but it's a sense, there is that kind of sense. And so it's a sort of a way in which politicians can excuse their reluctance to start having those conversations and sort of bringing people along with the realization of what needs to happen. I think, sadly, the emerging effects of climate change are going to increasingly bring home to people the reality of this. The difficulty is that we can't wait until we see those effects, and they're changing everybody's everyday lives. By the time that is convincing to everyone, it will be far too late to solve the climate crisis. So we can't rely on that. I think it is about politicians being prepared to share some of these hard truths. But I totally I accept your point, Kezia, about not letting representative politicians off the hook on this stuff. On the other hand, and I should declare an interest here as a trustee of a public, as a deliberative democracy charity called Involve, but I've heard some really interesting stories from people who have participated in those sorts of climate assemblies and so on, who have completely transformed their sort of having been taken through the process. And obviously that's only for a small subset of people, and as you say, maybe they're a particular subset of society as well, but people who've completely changed their view and have gone out to become real sort of champions within their communities for the issues that they now understand. And even, there was an amazing woman who was involved in the Westminster Climate Assembly who, had no kind of view on climate at all before she was involved. And afterwards, she'd gone out, she'd bought herself a second-hand electric car, and she'd become a councillor because she decided that actually she hadn't realised how important this stuff was, and she wanted to make the change in her local community. So, obviously that's only a very narrow thing, but I do think these techniques have potential.
I've got two more questions for you, and the next one's from the audience, and the one after that is from me directly. The first is going to be very long, and the second is going to be quite short, but they're both incredibly difficult. So I'm warning you now. And actually, this first one from the audience, I think, is addressed in great detail in the chapter in your book around the House of Commons and the Houses of Parliament being sidelined in some of these big questions. But let me just read it out for the benefit of the audience and give you a moment to consider it. Do you think the neoliberal globalised economic context contributes to this lack of trust? Global corporations and international organisations have incomes in excess of some nations and can easily avoid scrutiny. In the meantime, control over public services has been handed over to privatised entities, and in areas such as labour and housing, the market is considered as being the best option to manage the situation. So is it actually quite rational to conclude that democratic institutions are largely irrelevant in the face of these dominant forces, that thus not worth participating in?
Well, that is, yes, a difficult question. I think, you know, there's a lot of truth in what the questioner says there. I think that if you compare to, and I, you know, in writing this book, I look back at some books that had been written, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Parliament did used to have quite a monopoly on decision making and control over, you know, as you say, you know, decisions that are now being made completely outside the democratic sphere because they're being made by private companies, they're being made by enormous global entities. And so one of the things I sort of say in the introduction is that I don't feel that Parliament has fully articulated to itself the way in which its role has changed over the last 30 years. And, you know, it also includes things like devolution. It did include, you know, the outsourcing of whole areas of policy to the EU. Obviously, that's now changed. But Parliament's role has changed, and parliamentarians need to kind of recognise that more fully, I think, than they sometimes do. And I think it is rational for people, and, you know, and sometimes this goes as far as conspiracy theorists, you know, but for people to think, actually, you know, Parliament isn't controlling any of this stuff. It's all being done, you know, by these big shadowy bodies who, you know, we don't understand, we don't have an insight into. And I think that is a reality that parliamentarians need to recognise. I think it's also, you know, something where often parliamentarians don't have the sort of technical understanding to properly scrutinise some of these things. So, you know, we're increasingly having decisions made in the context of sort of social media, but many other things as well, by algorithms, where parliamentarians don't necessarily have the technical expertise to understand what that means and how it's working. But actually, the way in which algorithms are framed can have massively discriminatory effects, or, you know, and just because of the way in which they've happened to have been written. And that stuff isn't even visible, let alone sort of within the remit and purview of democracy to scrutinise. Excuse me. So I think it is a kind of rational fear and a reality that we have to adjust to. I don't think, though, it's a reason not to engage with representative democracy. It's a reason to seek to strengthen representative democracy and to think, right, how can we equip ourselves for this new reality? You know, is it about regulating some of these spaces? And obviously, we're starting to get into a conversation now about regulating big tech and so on. Is it about increasing the resources and the expertise available to parliamentarians in different areas to help them do their job better? Is it about you know, changing the, you know, the shape and you know, what it is that we say that Parliament has the, you know, scope to scrutinise? Because it did used to be the case, certainly in Westminster, that it, you know, select committees very narrowly looked at government departments, and now there is much more of a sense that they can look at their sort of policy area in general. Now, how do we? Are there changes we need to make in terms of like the procedures of Parliament to equip them to do that in a way that means they have access to the information which otherwise might, at the moment, seem inaccessible and so on? So these are really challenging questions, but I absolutely don't think that giving up on democracy, on representative democracy, is the correct response.
Good, we agree. Everybody at the Jones Centre is now nodding their heads in full agreement. To the short question, though, which I think is equally difficult, how do you change a system that doesn't want to change?
Well, that is a very good, also a difficult question, and one that I sort of reflect on in the book, because I come up with sort of in a hopeful sort of non-partisan technocrats way some sort of things which I think would make Parliament better. But at the end of the day, I recognise that there are lots of vested interests in Parliament who are, you know, and this includes government and opposition, and governments of different parties over time. You know, they don't have an interest in making Parliament better because it makes their lives harder. So what can you do about that? And I think there was kind of two main answers. So one is around persistence, and it's around sort of, there's a former MP in Westminster who also used to be a politics professor. He has this Tony Wright, and he has this idea of sort of cracks and wedges. So it's about sort of people who really are focused on improving Parliament, finding the cracks and getting their wedge in and pushing and trying to change things and being persistent and getting stuff done and taking opportunities when they present themselves. So I think it's about, that's kind of the spirit of my book, right? I don't expect people to pick it up and do everything that's in it straight away, but putting those ideas out there, having a debate, coming and talking to you about it is a way of flagging that these are issues and problems and that there are things that potentially we can do about it. We don't just have to throw our hands up in horror and say, it's all dreadful. So there's that side of it. The other side, which is the kind of slightly depressing reality, is that sometimes you only get change when there's some form of disaster. So, often it's in the aftermath of a scandal that people are pushed to recognize a problem and to want to offer a solution. And that's what we saw after the expenses scandal in Westminster, where MPs' expenses were just outsourced to an external independent body because they were just creating too many problems for people, and people wanted to show that there had been a change. We also got, in the aftermath of expenses, a whole series of changes to procedures within the House, which were seen as sort of rebalancing power between government and Parliament. So things like elections of chairs to select committees, which have seemed to have had a very positive effect on the independence of select committees and so on. So a sort of scandal can generate an opportunity for change, or another form of kind of disaster. The other thing I think is an opportunity often is a change of administration. So whether that's a change of Prime Minister or, the case of Scotland, the First Minister, or a general election. So it can be the case that politicians wanting to define themselves against something that went before can be encouraged to take up can encourage themselves to take on an agenda for change. So, it may be that if at some point the Conservative Party decides to get rid of Boris Johnson, that if someone following him wants to say, this is all a lot of ifs and hypotheses, but if the reason he goes is to do with his behaviour over Partygate and so on, it might be that a successor wants to say, look, I'm going to be whiter than white on this stuff, and I'm going to introduce some sort of ways to strengthen the ethical standards system in Westminster. Equally, it might be that opposition parties, seeing that if they think there is an electoral kind of consequence to that behaviour for the Conservative Party, might build some of that stuff into their manifesto for the next election, and that might lead to change. So it's a kind of, it's either sort of chipping away, which can feel like a sort of a thankless task that's never going to get anywhere, but sometimes you then get one of these sort of big cracks which opens up for some reason, and if you've got some of these ideas and these thoughts and these arguments that have been made and put on the table, maybe you can sort of achieve them in that moment.
I was pleased that you referenced the Tony Wright quote, because it was one of the ones that I marked up in the book as being really striking in the context of talking about exploiting cracks and getting wedges into doors. He then goes on to say that what's required is relentless pressure and ingenuity on the part of those who want to strengthen Parliament. So actually, I think it's down to us. It's down to the work of the Institute for Government and the John Smith Centre to keep doing some of that heavy lifting. We are getting close towards the end of this session, Hannah, so I wonder if we could really just spend a little bit more time talking about trust. And I think, the conversation we've had so far, we've set out very well through the evidence of the events that have happened and everything else, how easy it is to lose trust, but how incredibly difficult it is to rebuild it. I mean, what would your advice be to politicians who desperately want this to be better? Where do they start?
So to go back to, recent events, I think politicians don't give enough weight to bigger questions of trust when small things happen. So I think it's about recognizing that actually your response to the small things matters as well as sort of big picture stuff. So it's small things like the fact that Imran Ahmed Khan, who was a Conservative MP, who was found, was prosecuted and found to have committed a sexual offence against a child, then didn't resign his seat for a number of weeks and wasn't pushed evidently to do so by the Conservative Party. I think that feels very odd to people. They think, surely there's been proven bad behaviour here. The party's not doing anything about it. It's about a swift response and modelling behaviour that we think is appropriate behaviour. And it appears, that's just to give one example, that in that instance that the Conservative Party prioritise that for whatever reason, but I think that has a damaging effect, and they probably have very good sort of political reasons for whatever it is that they didn't do it. But I think not appreciating the kind of drip effect is a bad mistake that people make. And so thinking about a swift and appropriate response to these sorts of ethical scandals, I think is like one thing that politicians can do. And modelling the behaviour that they would like others to follow is another thing, because that tone from the top, I think, is essential in terms of people's calculations about how they can behave. So, I can do this thing. What will happen to me? Will the chief whip come down on me like a ton of bricks? Will I be disowned by the party? Probably not. Oh, well, the barrier to my doing that thing is much less. So I think sort of swift and appropriate responses, tone from the top is really important, and just appreciating how those things add up in people's views, in that kind of like, oh, well, they're all the same, and all politicians are sort of in it for themselves, and those sorts of attitudes just get added to. Then I think one of there's a whole chapter which I call exceptionalism, and that is this idea which gets too rapidly, I think, indoctrinated into MPs when they're elected, that they are special and that the rules don't necessarily apply to them. And I think they should flip that on their head and think, I have this enormous privilege of being an MP and representing the people, and therefore I need to be the exemplar, not the exception, of how to behave and what I want society to look like. That is a big thing to put on people, but at the same time we are they have got this opportunity to be one of a small number of people who are running the country. So I think it's not actually unreasonable for them to just check themselves that actually there are reasons why MPs are and politicians are special, and I talk about some of those in the book. There are good reasons that some things don't apply to them, but actually lots of things, HR rules, financial rules, those sorts of things absolutely should apply to them. And then I think there's something around Parliament as an institution, recognising that it doesn't exist for the benefit of the current set of MPs. It exists for the public and for the people. And so decisions about things like restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster shouldn't be primarily driven by the preferences of people who happen to currently sit in the Palace of Westminster. There needs to be much more effort to think about, what does the public deserve from this? What does the public want? And what do potential future generations of MPs want? Because Parliament is run and organised, and the physical building exists in a certain way which reflects the preferences of MPs gone by, who decided that's how it should be. And actually all the people who might want to become MPs, who would bring enormous things to Parliament, but wouldn't contemplate it because of the way politics is currently done, don't get any say in that. And I think that's there are good reasons why it's set up that way, but actually there needs to be serious reflection in Parliament about how you get more of the kind of sense of MPs' role as stewards of the institution, not just as sort of current occupants of the building.
There's lots of academic evidence to say that the way that you build trust is to make sure that rules are followed, and that when they're not followed, there are consequences for breaking those rules. We've actually had some crowdsourced solutions from our audience, which includes ensuring MPs declare any external income that they get, having clear job descriptions for members of Parliament, and when they have those rights, responsibilities should flow from that, and no honours after political donations for a considerable period of time. We're going to have to stop there though, Hannah, because we are almost clean out of time. Thank you so much for your conversation today. The book Held in Contempt, What's Wrong with the House of Commons, is available in all good bookshops right now, and it's a thoroughly enjoyable, very accessible read. I would encourage everybody watching to get a hold of their own copy. Thank you so much, Hannah, for your time, and thank you to everyone who's been watching. If you're doing so live, please take a moment to complete the evaluation form that's going to pop up on your screen and then arrive in your inbox so you can't escape it. It really helps us shape all our future events. We'll be back next week with the latest event in our Power Hour series. We'll be talking to the outgoing president of COSLA, Alison Evison, about tomorrow's local government elections, what the results are and what they mean for public services across Scotland. And if you'd like to be the first to know about any of our future events, please also take a moment to sign up to our newsletter. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.